Hi, class. All right, we're looking at chapter 12, Socio-Emotional Development in Adolescence. It's an interesting chapter. We're going to look at some different theories in this chapter that we haven't talked about before. But we'll just start with the beginning. Self-esteem is how the chapter begins. What we do know is during adolescence, especially the early part of adolescence, there is statistically, there is a drop in self-esteem for both males and females. Although the research is a little bit sketchy about it, some will say that males don't have a drop, but overall we see a drop of it. And I want you to be thinking of when we see this drop, remember self-esteem is that overall view of themselves, that usually what happens is this drop really presents itself during middle school. Remember we talked about middle schools being developed in 1930s, 1920s, 1930s? And so that is usually when we see this drop. Again, most of the researchers are going to say that we see it in both the males and females. Some will say that it's just in females or that the drop is more extreme in females. It is a time of developing our identity. So our identity is who we are separate from our parents. It's composed of a lot of pieces: vocation, religion, political beliefs, relationships, achievement, sexual identity, cultural identity, interest, who our personality develops, who we are physically. So let's start though with Erik Erikson. His theory describes during this time as identity versus identity confusion. And so what that means is that this is a time when one develops their own identity separate from their parents. And so if the parents would prevent that from happening, Erikson would say they would have identity confusion. So that means it's that parent, remember that authoritarian approach that says it's my way, the highway? You're going to be thinking the way I think, or you're not going to be thinking at all. Something like that effect. And so, as we go through this stage, Erikson says this is the psychosocial moratorium. It's the gap between childhood and adulthood. Now, so that's Erikson's approach. There's also James Marcia. I like James Marcia because, to me, it kind of fits in with Erikson's approach. He says that we go through periods of crises and commitments. 4 stages called the MAMA cycle: the moratorium, achievement, and moratorium crises. So let me go through. He says there's 4 ways this could play itself out. There's identity diffusion. That's where a teenager hasn't experienced a crisis or made a commitment. There's identity foreclosure. That means he made a commitment. There's no crises. And then there's identity moratorium, that in their midst of a crisis. And identity achievement is undergone a crisis and made a commitment. So in the class, what I'll do is I will ask a student how this might play itself out. And let's take a look at it from a vocational perspective, because I think it really lends itself well to James Marcia's theory. So people typically will look at a vocation. They might think that, well, when I'm in high school, I want to become an NFL football player, or I want to be an actress. And then what happens is that reality sets in, and sometimes they might become an actress or a football player, but more likely they evaluate things and they decide, I think that I have maybe an aptitude in this area, and it's a greater likelihood that I'm going to be successful in this area than be NFL football player. And so that would be an example of identity moratorium. They're in the midst of a crisis. They're trying to figure out what they want to do. And then identity achievement is they've undergone a crisis, and then they made a commitment saying, I want to become a pharmacist, or I want to become a doctor, or I want to become a nurse. And so that is that moratorium achievement. And again, it's the MAMA cycle And so James Marcia says that they go through this moratorium achievement through various different components of who they are. We identified in the beginning of this little video clip. Now, some have identity refusion. That means they've not yet experienced a crisis or made a commitment. And so this is a person who's really identity confused, looking back at Erik Erikson. So they've never really figured out who they are. Then there's identity foreclosure, and these are people that may have made a commitment, but there was no crisis. And so kind of an example of that is a family business. So, our grandfather did this, your great-grandfather did this, and so I'm doing it, and you're going to do it because it's part of a family business. That might be an example of identity foreclosure from a vocational perspective. Now again, remember that there's identity involves a whole lot more than just vocations, but I think that lends itself well to that example. Okay, ethnic identity is also identified or touched on in the text. That's where there's a sense of membership to one's culture. It can go bad here. You can be so strongly aligned with that one culture that you think that your culture is superior to everybody else's culture. Probably not a healthy way of looking at things. All cultures have strengths and weaknesses. And so the text talks about the bicultural identity, and that's somebody who feels comfortable in their own culture, but they feel comfortable with other cultures as well. They like being in the macro culture. Religious and spiritual development. What we do know is that religiousness declines between the ages of 14 to 20, more so in developed countries than in developing countries. Families, there's a challenge during adolescence where they've got autonomy versus independence. And so we've got autonomy versus attachment with the parents. And usually the conflicts that are there are usually not a big deal. They're like cleaning your room, coming in at a reasonable time. Sometimes, remember we talked about a third of people that have had a difficult time during adolescence. And so that third is going to have some challenges during this time. And just as a side note, I want to mention it now, we can go back to early childhood, those children that have that difficulty in early childhood, in infancy, remember the difficult child, it's kind of following that pathway. And what we're going to see when we go into adulthood is they're also going to have challenges in marriages. Not always, so it's not the kiss of death. I want you to think that. But that's what we see, this trend that's going on there. Some strategies to kind of deal with those conflicts. Show warmth and respect. The text talks about that. I'm glancing over my notes. Sustain interest in their lives. Understand and adapt to their cognitive and socio-emotional development. And have high expectations. And present constructive ways of dealing with problems. And understand, most importantly, they don't become adults overnight. Peers, unfortunately, remember we talked about that imaginary audience last chapter? Well, we're seeing it in the role of conformity. And so peer pressure plays a huge role in how we function. In fact, Solomon Asch did a study, it's not in your text, but Solomon Asch did a study looking at the role of peer pressure, and it is amazing how one can succumb to it. Won't spend much time on that now, just for brevity's sake. Let's see. Friendships, again, Harry Stack Sullivan is kind of the go-to guy for this. He talks about the social needs being met during adolescence. Remember, we talked about that conformity. What we find, too, with peer groups is the 8th and 9th grade, that's when if they're going to spike in an antisocial perspective, that's when it's going to happen. And it's just about that peer group thing that plays a role in our conformity. Dating, 3 stages. There's romantic attractions and affiliations. This is from 11 to 13. That's usually the onset of puberty, and so there's an attraction towards another. Then there's then there's exploring romantic relationships. That's 14 to 16, and that's where there's like some dating or some group dating It's pretty marginalized as far as emotional content is concerned until around age 17 to 19, and that's where they have what they call dyadic romantic relationships, more of a monogamous relationship with another person, and it kind of mirrors what happens in adulthood. Text addresses rites of passage. Rites of passage are a ceremony or a ritual that marks the kind of a demarcation from adolescence to adulthood. Some cultures have ceremonies that's associated with it. Here in America, we've got sweet 16s. We have a driver's license, ability to, age 18, going to college or going into the military, moving out independently. These are all like rites of passages. Excuse me. Juvenile delinquency, very big concern, especially remember we talked about that 8th and 9th graders, kind of a spike in antisocial behavior. Well, this is more likely when we're going to see some juvenile delinquency beginning to occur. What's interesting about it is that typically we look at juvenile delinquency in two ways, and that's age. Early onset, before the age of 11, delinquent behavior is more likely to carry on into adulthood. After the age of 11, especially during this time, it's more likely just a stage and they're going to move past it. Erickson would say that this is a time of developing one's identity, although not a very good one, a negative one. Some things that are associated with it: lower socioeconomic status, being tough or masculine, parents not skilled in parenting a child with delinquent behavior, some cognitive factors like low self-control. Remember, we've got that prefrontal lobe that's developing. That's where you can resist impulsivity and delay gratification. Well, that's still going on. Your brain isn't completely developed until between ages of 22 and 24, so you might have a get-out-of-jail-free card there with that. Depression and suicide, big concern. Females have higher rates of depression than males do. Second leading cause of death, although sometimes it goes to the third leading cause of death. It kind of fluctuates back and forth. Text talks about some prevention programs that involve direct interaction with the individual, community, early identification, and intervention. And with that said, guys, that's at least a little introduction to Chapter 12. I hope these film clips are helpful for you. I know I enjoy doing them. It's really kind of cool to be able to go through the summary of the whole book. All right, well, thank you so much, and we will see you in a little bit.